Welcome back to another Q&A. I hope you guys have been enjoying these as much as I have. This is our fifth Q&A where you guys ask unique, fascinating questions and I discuss them. So this subscriber asks, do you believe we should obey the 10 commandments? Shouldn't we still keep the Sabbath? Jesus said he did not come to abolish the law. Excellent question and excellent point. The fourth commandment, to keep the Sabbath day holy, to rest on this day, is the only commandment out of the 10 that says, remember the Sabbath day. Now, when it comes to this topic, I want to talk about a logical fallacy that two groups of believers often commit concerning this topic of the Sabbath, if we should keep it or if we shouldn't keep it. On one side, some believers will say that the Sabbath doesn't matter anymore, that the New Testament is very silent on this topic, and so we don't have to keep it, and that Sunday replaced the Sabbath. And then you have a polar opposite group that says that the church completely changed the Sabbath day to Sunday, and that we shouldn't worship and fellowship together on Sunday and instead keep the Sabbath. So one group is saying don't keep the Sabbath, another group is saying don't worship on Sunday. I believe that's a false dichotomy, a complete logical fallacy that incorrectly presents only two opposing options, as if these two options are the only possibilities, when in reality, there's a third option. Both worshiping and gathering on Sunday is okay and it is important, and having a full day of rest on the Sabbath and remembering the Sabbath day is also important. Both groups assume that Sunday replaced the Sabbath day, but that is completely false. When you look into early church history, the early church did not replace the Sabbath with Sunday. Sunday was the day of Jesus' resurrection, and it became the primary day of Christian worship. Back then, it wasn't even understood as a replacement of the Sabbath, especially because many early Christians, especially those of Jewish backgrounds, continued to observe the Sabbath Saturday along Sunday worship. So let's talk about that group that believes the Sabbath is completely irrelevant to the believer and has no value in any sense, and the kind of reasonings they use to suggest that. The first main argument that they love to use is another logical fallacy known as the argument from silence. They believe that because it seems that the New Testament is silent on the topic of the Sabbath, we do not have to observe the Sabbath, even though it's part of the 10 commandments. Now, this in itself is a logical fallacy because it interprets silence as evidence for or against a claim, when the silence itself doesn't offer any specific meaning. So it's that old saying, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. But the truth of the matter is that the New Testament is not silent on this topic, it just doesn't explicitly talk about the Sabbath. For example, within the book of Acts, the disciples kept the Sabbath 85 times. The New Testament records the apostles, including Apostle Paul, participating in Sabbath observance. And then another argument people love to use against the Sabbath is saying the random phrase, we don't need the Sabbath rest anymore because Jesus is our rest. But that in itself is a very random statement because that's like saying, I don't need to exercise, Jesus is my exercise. I don't need to eat right and diet, Jesus is my diet. I don't need to rest correctly, Jesus is my rest. I don't need to have a good sleeping schedule, Jesus is my sleeping schedule. A lot of believers today have a very carnal view of God's commandments, and they assume that if the commandment is not about salvation or morality, then there's no value whatsoever in observing that commandment. So an example of a salvational commandment or a moral commandment is something like having faith in Jesus Christ in order to be saved and forgiving others' trespasses so that your trespasses can be forgiven by God. And so a lot of believers would say these are the only kind of laws we need to consider, both moral and salvational, and everything else can be ignored and it has no value. And again, that's a carnal way to look at God's commandments because a lot of God's laws also have to do with health specifically. Like God's dietary restrictions, right? What's unclean and what's clean. What's healthy for a person to eat and what's not healthy. Laws on fasting. Resting on the Sabbath day is also a health law, like having real rest. In fact, the origins of the Sabbath day goes all the way back to the book of Genesis chapter 2. Where it states that on the seventh day, God ended his work and rested and blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, meaning that he set the seventh day apart for something sacred and holy, which is rest. Within the book of Genesis, God was literally showing us the work-rest cycle for humans. I mean, he is literally the designer of our bodies. He knows exactly how our bodies work, the best type of fuel source, the best type of rest that we need. He designed our bodies, so he knows exactly what our bodies need. In fact, there's something really interesting about the Sabbath day commandment. The fact that it says, remember the Sabbath day, suggests prior knowledge to this day. It implies that resting on the Sabbath, the seventh day, was not a brand new concept. It was something the people had encountered before and were being called to continue honoring. It's like me saying, remember the 4th of July. That suggests that you have prior knowledge to the 4th of July. And we can see evidence of the Sabbath being observed before Moses gave this commandment on Mount Sinai. In the book of Exodus, chapter 16, it literally says, when God gave manna in the wilderness, he instructed the people not to gather it on the 7th day. So the Sabbath principle already existed, hence why it says, remember the Sabbath day. And how long has it existed for? All the way back to Genesis when God sanctified it in the very beginning. A lot of people make the argument and say, well, I rest on Sunday when I go to church and when I fellowship, but in reality, that's not necessarily true rest if you really think about it. You're getting up to go to church, and then after church, you're hanging out with friends, going out to eat, and you're going out shopping, and then you have to plan for the next day because it's a Monday, it's a work day. You might have to meal prep, you might have to answer some emails, make your schedule. So you're not necessarily truly resting. It is an important day to gather and fellowship with believers and hang out with friends and family, but it's not true rest, especially because in the evening you have to plan for the next day or for the entire week. However, the Sabbath day, it was a day of full rest, meaning there was no work, there was no planning for the next day. It was complete true rest. And contrary to popular belief, this commandment wasn't just for Moses and his people back in the day, it was even for the strangers within their gates. The book of Exodus, chapter 20, verse 10, literally states that animals wouldn't work on this day, strangers wouldn't work on this day, which means that the non-Israelites living among them also observed the Sabbath rest. So what are some benefits of having a true full day of rest, like a real rest day where you're not planning for the next day, you're disconnected, you're not working, you're not doing anything but resting, fellowshipping, relaxing, giving the body and the mind a true day of rest? So here are just some of the benefits. Stress reduction. A true weekly day of rest can help lower cortisol, which is a stress hormone, which can reduce anxiety, depression, and the risk of stress-related illnesses. Resting and disconnecting from work-related stressors allows for better sleep patterns and overall sleep quality. Having true rest enhances your immune function. Chronic stress and overwork suppresses the immune system. Regular rest boosts immune response, making the body more resilient to infections and diseases. Having a full day of rest helps with mental clarity and productivity. Rest improves cognitive function, memory, creativity. This mental reset boosts productivity when one returns to work. There are a lot of testimonies of believers out there. I'm sure you guys have some of your own testimonies concerning truly resting on the Sabbath day and how it improved productivity at work and in all aspects of your life. As my friend once said, the better you rest, the better you work. I think a lot of us are truly exhausted and we've never truly had a full day of rest, right? Even though we get the weekends off, we're still planning for the next day and we got our side hustles and we're doing this and that and shopping and going out to eat. We never truly have a full day to just reset, relax the mind, and relax the body. Another benefit of having a full day of true rest is regular rest periods can help regulate hormonal cycles that govern appetite, energy, and mood, which helps with hormonal balance. So again, the Sabbath day was made for our benefit, and Jesus says this within the book of Mark, where he says that the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath, meaning that we weren't made for the Sabbath day. This day was explicitly made for us, a true day of rest. So even though the Sabbath day is not necessarily a specific direct moral law, I believe indirectly it does lead you to be a better moral person. When you're well rested, you treat people better. You have more energy to serve, you have more energy to study, you have more energy to work, you have more energy to help people. And so despite God's health laws not being directly linked to salvation or morality, it absolutely does have values because the mind, body, and spirit, it's all connected. So it's important that we get proper rest, a proper diet, that we fast properly, that we do all these things and we don't just neglect God's laws. And the fact that God would give us a blueprint on how to properly rest during the week, and a blueprint on healthy eating and fasting and other health-related laws should really strengthen your faith and make you appreciate God that much more. It also helps with evangelizing. We can show the world that look how much God loves us. He gave us a blueprint on what we should eat and what we shouldn't eat. He gave us a blueprint on how to rest. He gave us a blueprint on how to treat people and how to love and how to walk correctly. I think we should appreciate these things and not neglect it, especially because it does benefit your life when you're well rested, when you're eating healthy, when you're eating clean. Maybe if we considered God's commandments, we would be healthier. There'd be less sick people. There'd be less tired people. I'll admit that I do not keep the Sabbath day perfectly. At my current job, currently I'm actually on call for Saturdays. So some days I get it completely off, other days I have to come in and deal with clients. But hopefully I'll be transitioning into a job that gives me the weekends fully off so that I can have more of a work-life balance and I'm able to observe Sabbath rest. I also think on the Sabbath, in order to have true rest, I think we should also disconnect from our electronics. And I'm also preaching to myself right now because that's often the day that I like to make a lot of content. But yeah, that's all I got for you guys today. I hope this video was very fruitful. I hope that you see the commandments from a different perspective. Because again, often people think if it has nothing to do with morality or salvation, then it has no value. I don't believe that. A lot of God's laws have to do with health because he's a loving father who loves his children. He created our bodies, so he knows exactly what we need. But let me know your honest thoughts in the comment section below. What do you think about the Sabbath day? You can also comment any testimonies that you might have concerning the Sabbath day and any positive improvements it's brought to your life. Also, feel free to comment more unique questions like this for future Q&As, and I'll be continuing doing these videos discussing these amazing topics. Thank you guys so much. Till next time.